But you are absolutely going to love my guest today. We've had him on the show before. He is always fascinating. Andrew Kaufman is here, and we appreciate, all that he brings. He's an MD. He's a public speaker, researcher, natural healing practitioner, business and homeschooling consultant. And we thank God for homeschooling that is going on right now. We've never really talked to Andrew about that, but yay, we really need that, especially since they're sexualizing children and you can't trust a thing that they're putting into the schools these days. And he's I'm not going to say that word right now because we're still on our channels. We're going to just tell you right now that in order for us to speak the truth on any matter, we'd like you to head over to Rumble. And JT, you're going to put that into the chats of all the places. So we're on Rumble. Head over there. Would you mind? Because we got some really important things to talk about and we can't do it in some places. So we want to be respectful, of our good platforms, of our good friends there at the bigwig national broadcasters that sometimes don't like what we put out. I will tell you that Andrew, he is... So he got his BS from MIT in molecular biology and completed his psychiatric training at Duke University Medical Center after graduating from the Medical University of South Carolina. So Andrew, we welcome you to the show today. Thank you very much for taking time to be with us from wherever parts of the world that you are. You're usually off in some exotic place, but thanks for being with us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with always. And I come from my home base today in central New York.
Okay.
We got some beautiful fall and early winter weather.
Right. So we've been hearing about New York. Are you in an area where, have they been having some protests and rallies and stuff like that there, or is New York staying out of it all?
Well, no, I'm sure in New York City, I've heard that there have been some pretty outrageous protests, but I am far away from that in the middle of the wilderness, so to speak, near the southern Adirondack Mountains. So fortunately, I'm in a different part of New York that's a lot more conservative and sane than down in the Big Apple.
Down in the Big Apple. Very good. So we're seeing some real, speaking of earthquakes, we're seeing some things in the financial areas. And not only have you brought to us a lot of information, speaking the truth on, what we've just experienced in the last 3 years and, in the crazy situation that we found ourselves, but there's some real shaking things that are going on financially in the world. And you've sort of been following up on all of that. And so what can you tell us, Andrew? What should we be concerned about and how can we protect ourselves if we need to?
Well, I wouldn't say I'm necessarily one to give financial advice, but I think if you understand a little bit about what's going on, it'll kind of be obvious what steps you might take to protect yourself and your family. But essentially what we have going on right now is a debt and currency crisis. And I think what we don't usually talk about this in the terms of how this all began. So I'm going to try to lend some insight. But if you just look at different markets, right, because of the spending, the quantitative easing, the creating of currency that went on during the COVID era, it left the mark of inflation, which has led the central banks, especially in the United States, which the US dollar is the world reserve currency. So regardless of what nation you live in and what your local economy is based upon, it's still connected to the US dollar. And because of the rising interest rates, and by the way, if we look back in the history of raising interest rates, most people may, or my age or older, may remember the name Paul Volcker, who was the Federal Reserve chairman back in the 70s, when the last time we had an inflation crisis. But at that time, even though the interest rate eventually was really high, about 20%, it only doubled from where it was when they started raising it. And they took several years to double the interest rate. But if you look at what's happened with the current Federal Reserve, they have raised the interest rate something like 18 times the starting value. Okay, so not double it, but made it 18 times more interest. And they've done this in a very, very rapid time. So it's left the banks in a big crisis because of the way that they put their money in bond markets, and treasury bonds and treasury bills are extremely poor investment now because of the change in the interest rates. And I'm not going to explain all the details, but if you look into it, you can see that this is part of why we have bank failures. But also because of the interest rates, you have people do not want to take out loans, and the banks have tightened their credit guidelines. So we have, people can't get car loans or don't want to take out car loans. Mortgages are very expensive, so people aren't buying houses and cars. And because of the wages are not keeping up with inflation, essentially people are poorer with their same salaries, and so they're taking on more credit card debt. And then we have a record number of defaults in the credit card industry. So you have essentially all these areas of defaults in debts, and I didn't even get into student loans. And this is all mounting to a big crisis, in the context of inflation and these high interest rates. Now, the government has really been minimizing these issues. And one of the things they've held on to is that the unemployment rate has been low. So that's given us a false sense that the economy is doing better than it has, along with other measures whereby banks get rescued from failure, or the stock market or precious metal prices are manipulated and propped up to make the economy look good. And at the same time, you have many non-Western nations around the world forming a coalition known as BRICS, which I believe stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. I must be missing one. China and South Africa. But many, many other nations have joined, including some of the oil-rich Middle Eastern nations. And their whole raison d'etre is to develop a currency outside of the dollar. So this is where my big moment of explanation can come into play of why we have this system where we're essentially have tons and tons of debt, huge deficits. No one can pay back their loans. It all actually goes back to 1933 and the last World War. Because what happened at that time was that the United States was also suffering from an economic depression. And because they had used emergency war powers in World War I and other wars, and this is a time when essentially an emergency gives politicians an excuse to do anything they want, right? This is how the COVID tests, vaccines were allowed to be sold, is because the government said, you don't have to do the normal thing, which is show that these things are safe and effective and get approval from our agencies. Because it's an emergency, just go sell what you have. Whether it's dangerous, it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. It's okay. Right? And all the rules go out the window, all constitutional protections go out the window during an emergency. But those emergencies were traditionally wars or natural disasters or famine, like things that were life and death situations. But in 1933, the US government under FDR decided that the issue with the monetary crisis or the financial crisis, which was really a shortage of money in the system. So there wasn't money to make loans and have businesses, be able to get financing to maintain their expenses. And that's essentially what was going on. So the government said, because it's an emergency, we're going to have a bank holiday, close all the banks. And then when we open up, essentially everything's going to be different. And what they did was completely flabbergasting and egregious, because they took the Trading with the Enemies Act from World War I and applied it to all the US citizens, saying that they were enemies of the state and they couldn't have money. And that's what the reason they had them all turn in their gold. They made owning gold illegal. Gold was real money. And they made the Federal Reserve notes, which they called Federal Reserve Bank notes, completely imaginary. And this is the truth still today. If you look at the Federal Reserve Act, Section 16, you'll see that a bank can get Federal Reserve notes when you sign a note for a loan. So, Laura, if you go into your bank and ask them for a loan, you think, you might think that they have that money and they would lend it to you. But that's not the case at all. Actually, what happens is they get you to sign an application and a promise to pay. And that's called collateral because you're a good, trustworthy woman. So you're going to pay back that loan, and that's collateral. So then they go to the central bank and they ask the central bank, can you give us this currency? And the central bank says, do you have collateral? And then they say, here's Laura Lynn's promise to pay. I give you my offer, my tender of Laura Lynn's promise. And then boom, they give them the money. Now that money didn't exist before. It comes into creation because you applied for it and you promised to pay. And there is no actual money. There's no gold. You can't trade it in for gold, right? Nobody had to possess something of value to give you that. It's basically imaginary, and this is called fiat currency. Now, each time we do that, it creates on paper debt that's never paid back. Because when we write a check or give Federal Reserve notes, those are the same things we created that way. So we can't pay them back with the same debt that we created in the first place. So it just essentially keeps adding up and adding up. And there are ways, by the way, to cancel it out and make it go away. But if we were taught how to do that, they couldn't use this financial system to control us. And this essentially crisis is leading to the central digital currency, which is basically we're going to be in such bad shape that they're going to say, we'll rescue you. We will cancel all your debt if you just adopt this app on your phone. And once people adopt that, then they're going to be, under essentially control because all of their access to the financial system will be controlled.
Wow. And that's how they get us because a lot of people, I'm seeing that people are overextended. We've had quite a few good years, like here in Canada, of the lowest rates of interest of all time. So you could borrow 500,000, 700,000, on the home of your dreams and amortize it over 25 years or whatever. And you got it at, 2%. 2.5%, 3%. It was like amazing. You can handle that payment. But all of a sudden, when it comes up for renewal, we're now seeing that beginning of those, the foreclosures and things like that are not, it's going to cause a lot of harm to folks. And so what you're saying is as they get into trouble or whatever, they're going to be able to capture us and have more control over us, I guess, by saying, well, we'll let you out of this debt, but you need to what? So what will this app be and do to us?
Right. Well, you're right, because when they have a crisis and people are desperate, they can come right in there with what seems like the solution, but it turns out it's not in your best interest. So this kind of an app, you can already find out information about it because it's similar to the social credit system that they have in China. It could be used that way. People from the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks, have already admitted that it could be used in a way to control people's access to the funds. So one of the things that they've talked about, for example, is something called negative interest rates. So you mentioned, right, that it was easy to get loans at low interest rates when the central bank set the prime interest rate at 0 or 0.125 or 0.25%, right, which it's been. But what if the interest rate were set at negative numbers, so that instead of you gaining interest, that the balance would actually shrink? Now, this might be a way to contract the money supply or to accelerate the velocity of money to stimulate spending in the economy if they say, well, we're setting an interest rate of negative 5%. So you basically, if there's anything left in your bank account at the end of the month, when the interest kicks in, it will be 5% will be taken off the top. Now, that is something that could easily be implemented. And so, for example, like austerity policies, which they've had in Puerto Rico and Greece and other places, when the government can't pay its debt back to the IMF or to the European Union in some cases, or in Puerto Rico's case, to the United States government and the other corporate creditors, then they would impose austerity measures, which could mean that they take money directly out of bank accounts. And this can also happen now, even in the Western countries, because of monetary reform that's been passed into law, where they can have bail-ins instead of bailouts. So if a bank does not have enough liquid assets to pay their depositors, and there's a bank run, it was in the past, we observed that the government, right, the FDIC and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury Department in the United States would bail the bank out by giving them money, essentially, or by buying shares of their bank, at a generous price, things like that. But now we could have what's called bail-ins, where if the bank, instead of the bank failing, in order to pay its depositors, it will just take money out of the other account holders who have more than, I believe, 100,000 US dollars in their account. And so above that, they can just take it off to, rob from Peter to pay Paul kind of scenario. So the digital currency would just make much easier these types of maneuvers. And the way that they plan to set it up is that you wouldn't actually have an account at a private or a commercial bank. You would have only account at the central bank. So all of your assets, your digital currency, would be in an account at the Federal Reserve Bank or the Central Bank of Canada or the Bank of England, depending on where you lived. And they would, be able to directly control your access to that account. So if they set the interest rate, they would take the funds out and such directly. There would be no intermediary. You would not be able to. Also, because of that system, you would no longer have any opportunity for privacy in your financial transactions. So now, we do have, most people use credit cards. And of course, every time you use your Apple Pay or your credit card, it is tracked. But you have the option of at least, doing business, at least some business in cash. And a cash transaction, cannot be easily monitored. A large one, they have a lot of restrictions in U.S. banking these days, like try taking $20,000 in cash out of the bank. But if you are, deliberate and careful, you can still do things in cash or through precious metals, possibly that are in the private. But in this kind of a digital system, essentially, there'll be almost no opportunity other than between, private men or women who could do, anything they want. But in the business world, in any store or retailer or online business, there'll be no opportunity to do any kind of private peer-to-peer transactions.
So do you see gold and silver as being an ongoing alternate currency? Is that the answer?
Well, gold and silver are real money. They meet all the criteria for money because they have their own intrinsic value. And you could think about it this way, like with gold, which gold doesn't have a lot of industrial applications, but it certainly is a beautiful metal. But the effort that it takes men to get gold out of the ground, right, creates the value because there's value in the labor of those men. And it roughly, the actual value of gold is somewhat equivalent to the number of hours that it takes someone to get it out of the ground. Now with silver, you have the added benefit of silver has amazing applications in technology. In fact, especially ironically in green technology, things like solar panels. It is the best conductor of electricity out of all the metals, and it has a very high light reflectance values. So it makes it very useful in technological applications. So it makes it very valuable. Now, gold and silver have been regarded as real money for thousands of years. In fact, I heard one advocate for gold do an analysis and went back to ancient Rome and looked up, what you could buy or what the price of, like a nice suit and a meal on the town was in terms of gold or silver back in ancient Rome. And essentially the same amount of gold or silver today will also buy you a nice suit and a nice dinner out. So these monies have preserved their purchasing power throughout history, right? They've stood the test of time. And silver, certainly because of its industrial applications, could not really be squashed. It's too necessary. In fact, people now are trying to develop technology to recycle it from old electronics, which, you can find just tiny, tiny amounts. But it's so important that they're willing to, put the effort into recovering those tiny amounts. So, I would say that these are a way to protect your assets from inflation, certainly, and from theft and coercion from the government, right? Because you can hold them privately, you can hide them securely, you can be confident that they will retain their purchasing power. They might not be perfect for every situation. Right? Because let's say that you want to buy a house and pay with silver. It would be hard to carry that much silver, for example.
Right. Yeah. Gold, maybe that wouldn't be that heavy.
Gold, you could definitely carry enough gold to pay for a
good down payment.
Nice home.
Yeah.
Sure.
Well, okay. Funny story, Andrew. I'll just say while you're talking about this, and then continue, please. But so recently we had some work done by someone for something that we needed done, and we didn't have the cash, but we had 2 gold coins that we had. We had three gold coins that we had invested in because we've been working with Steve Merrill, a fellow from Canada, and he's been telling us that gold and silver is the way to go. So we kept, putting money away for a rainy day. So it comes to paying this guy, and we're like, oh shoot, it's a bit, maybe we should, cash out the gold. And then we thought, well, why don't we offer him the gold? Because it'll pay for, what he's done. And then it has the potential of going up, and we'll say, hey, we'll go down to the bank or to the gold and silver guy, and we can cash this in and we'll give you cash tomorrow. Or do you want to take this gold and think about keeping it for then? Because we really had no choice. We didn't have any more cash. And so, so the guy says, and he held it. He held the 3 gold things, and we were kind of sad because we thought they were really pretty, and we didn't really want to get rid of them. But so he held them, and he kind of flipped them around. He goes, I've never done this, but I guess I could do it. And they said, what? We said, well, today's value, and we rattled off the day's value of the gold. And we said, potentially it's worth $200 more in a month or 2 months. Potentially it's worth double that in a year, potentially. And so he weighed it, and he goes, well, and we said, okay, we can go get you cash if you're worried about it. And he says, well, okay, He just kind of decided he'd do it. And we said, listen, you got 1 day, take it. We'll consider this paid. But if you want to give it back or you change your mind, you let us know. And he never did. So that became our bartering and I've also given somebody
Laura Lynn,
a little silver coin.
You did him such a huge favor.
Yeah.
Because I bet the reason he was reluctant is because he's like, all right, well, what am I going to do? I guess I'm just going to save this. I'm going to put it, in a shoebox and bury it in my backyard, or put it in my gun safe. And instead of, spending that on something he didn't really need, now he's got a little nest egg, right? That sometime in the future, like you say, because, it could also go down in price, and that does happen, right? But in the long term, you're right, you're going to be protected. If we had, a Weimar Republic situation in the United States with hyperinflation, and suddenly it was $100,000 for a loaf of bread, right? You'd still be able to take, a tenth of an ounce of silver and buy a loaf of bread.
Right.
Right, which is what it's worth now, right?
Which is what
about
the Bible
$2.50.
actually says will happen. Like that's pretty sad that we might have to spend that much for a loaf of bread. It talks about end times, but a Weimar Republic, you said. So what does that phrase mean?
So the Weimar Republic was the government in Germany after World War I, and
Okay.
because of the I can't remember the name of the accord, but Germany was ordered to pay reparations that were far beyond its ability to pay. And so what it did was it did the same thing that we did in the United States, because the whole world did this, because they declared an emergency and that they couldn't pay. And so they went off the gold mark, which was backed by gold. They had, German marks were backed by gold. They were called gold mark. And they then started printing just the mark based on fiat, right? Based on a promise to pay. And they used that to pay back the war reparations. But of course, because it wasn't backed by anything and because they had so many reparations to pay, it became extremely devalued and went into hyperinflation. And that's really what created the situation where the Nazis were able to rise to power, because it was, chaos and a major crisis of economic scandals. I mean, people had to spend their money immediately, because if they waited even one day, it would be worth less. So it was like, imagine, working a day, getting paid at the end of the day, and then going immediately to the store and spending every penny that you made as quickly as possible before it lost value. And then, of course, they couldn't buy goods from outside of Germany, and it was just a disaster.
Do you think that could happen? Like, I did have a friend recently, and she had $200,000 sitting in her bank account. And, I got over being envious and all the jealousy that I felt in my heart over it and everything. And then I said, are you doing the right thing? Like, if you want to protect those funds, shouldn't you just get that money out of just sitting in the bank? I mean, and her and her husband were thrilled about it. They'd made a real estate investments, and, they had some extra cash. And so that was fantastic. But I said, so looking at the world, is it really safe to be having and harboring all this cash? In a day, couldn't it be devalued in a crisis? If the Federal Reserve and the fiat currency is exposed, what could happen?
Yeah, I agree. Because of the looming crisis and, the brink of international bankruptcy, I think all assets that are denominated in fiat currency of any kind, right? And it's all of it is going to be tied to the US dollar because of the world reserve currency status, that they're a lot riskier right now. So that means stocks, bonds, even gold and silver certificates, right? The paper versions of gold and silver are denominated in dollars. So all of that paper is much, much riskier right now, including just keeping it in the bank. So, one thing to consider is that if you put it in a tangible asset, right, something you can hold. So like buying a piece of land or buildings, right, no matter what the value of the dollar is, a building is still worth something. Land is, you can grow food on land, you could live on land, right? It has intrinsic value. You get vehicles, they have value, firearms, tools, generators, right? Equipment, all these things have value, just like precious metals also have value. So anything that has value intrinsically like that, because it's useful or functional or purposeful, will still have value no matter what happens to the currency. So I think, having those types of assets are much safer. Now is not the time to speculate on the stock market unless you really know what you're doing. And actually, people that want to invest wisely, who, can buy foreclosed real estate, provided they are set up with the right kind of, credit. And there are lots of people teaching how you could prepare yourself, or like shorting stocks and assets, which is risky, but that's how the big wealthy financiers make money during an economic downturn. And that's when you borrow shares temporarily, betting that the price will go down because the price of everything's going down. And then if it goes down in the time that you borrow them, then because what you do is you sell the shares at the higher price and then buy them back at the lower price and then keep the profits. And that type of strategy is how people can look to actually increase their wealth during these times. But I don't think I'm anyone that's listening here. If you're going to do that, you already know about that and you're already prepared for it. Most people are probably listening to this or who aren't already doing the things that I'm talking about or have done them, are probably not fully aware of the risks and vulnerabilities here because of this fact that, right, all of this debt is just keep building, and it has to rupture, creating this crisis at some point. And it seems that point is fairly imminent, months to years away.
Right. Well, I heard somebody talking about an article like just here in Canada that that maybe we're not going to see the soft landing we were hoping for, that could be, people keep using these, a bit of a rough ride or whatever. But so you would probably be more aware of the United States of America. I mean, how on earth do we get out of this huge mess where, we're in Canada, we're trillions of dollars in debt. Like, how do we ever recover? This is a mess.
Yeah, well, this is, why they reorganize every so often, right? There's been bankruptcies and reorganizations of various governments around the world when the debt becomes due. And I think that this is what we're going, and that's what the new digital currency represents, right? It's essentially a reorganization, a restructuring of the debt settlements, plans, debt forgiveness, jubilee, and then a new system which will eventually lead to the same exact problems. When we used gold as money, we didn't have these volatility cycles of boom and bust, where we have recessions and then booms and inflation and deflation. All of this has really occurred. Now, it did happen in the past, but only when governments were devaluing currency, which is just really what the central bank does by just printing up large amounts of it, not based in anything of real value, with no money being in the system. Back when they had gold and silver coins in ancient Rome, when they started doing this, they actually clipped little pieces off the coin and then mixed that, with other metals to make new coins. And, just like they've done with quarters, dimes, and nickels and pennies, right? Quarters and dimes used to be silver, 90% silver for a period of time, and then 40% silver in the US. And of course, they started making them with cheap base metals. And then all those silver coins disappeared from circulation because as soon as people got them, they put them in their bank. And now you can actually, that's one of the kinds of silver you could buy. They call it junk silver. And that's a very good kind to have in that situation where you might buy a loaf of bread with a silver coin, because they're in, small denominations. And people, they're minted by, the official government mint. So people are familiar with them.
So how does it work? Because there's an aspect of humanity that will never really struggle. Like people living, like, let's say in downtown New York, obviously they can afford these condos that are thousands of dollars a month, and they seem to be, surviving. Like there's a part of our world that doesn't really get affected. And it makes me sad about the part of the world that does get affected immediately. And we're seeing this in Vancouver, between Vancouver and Chilliwack, like out on a stretch of Highway 1, we've got these little tent cities that are going up. this obviously has to be the people that they just couldn't even take the first rise in grocery bills. You know what I mean? It's sort of those really, really struggling. And my heart goes out for that. And then it's going to be, you know, the lower income and then middle income. It could eventually just really, especially those that, you know, afforded a home with a 2% interest rate, but can't do it at 7%. And they have to sell. And then they're forced to sell at a reduced rate. Perhaps they have to sell at their home for far less than they even paid for it. So they're at a loss now. Like this is the levels of society that are beginning to really feel the harm. But certain parts of society, they don't actually get that affected by gas prices or food prices.
Well, remember what I said about how this currency actually comes into existence, right? Because it's created when you get a loan and make a promise to pay. Now, this way of doing things, right, where you don't actually put in your hard labor, right, for gold or silver, and then it's much more equalized. So the people who are in the privileged classes, right, like you described, they're extended this credit at will, right, because they, a regular average person cannot, get a $10 million loan, but their signature on a promissory note would create the same $10 million that one of those swanky downtown New York apartment owners would get. But those elites know how to utilize the system, and they're given privileges within the system. And most of the people are essentially manipulated as debt slaves, right? That we have so many obligations. I mean, even home ownership, like you described, it's not true ownership, right? We don't save up and buy a modest home or piece of property and build our own home on it and, put our sweat equity into it, right? We buy these homes on credit and with a 30-year obligation, which means that even if it's 2% interest, like we're paying more than the entire value of the home in the interest because it's compounded over 30 years. And they just approved in the United States a 40-year loan. So in other words, these types of arrangements, even though you feel you get the benefit of home ownership and maybe people have had bigger and more spacious or luxurious homes over the generations, it essentially creates a lifetime of debt and that you can never get out of. So you have to keep working and earning and slaving away. And if you are unable to do that, as you describe, right, you'll essentially be put out on the street. So, that's not true home ownership, right? True home ownership means that no matter what you do, that's your home for life. And that's a much more humane and better way to live. And I think that's how people used to have it. And I'd like to get back to that in the future instead of a system of more slavery and manipulation.
Well, tie into what you're saying, Andrew, tie into that, these landowners who get multiple properties, because of their success or flipping, and they have multiple properties, and then the prices in order to rent are just astronomical. It drives up the prices of the properties. Here in Canada, our housing is about the most expensive, one of the most expensive places to live in the world, to own a home. And largely because it was cheap here, I guess, compared to some places in Hong Kong or China, and they'd come and they'd buy multiple properties. We had them sitting, nobody was even in them. They would just buy up properties. And so Canada got upset about that and put some stop gates on certain parts of it. But, it's almost impossible to find good rent now without paying the price of really and truly a mortgage. My mortgages are, in my past, were the same amount that anyone's paying for rent right now.
Yeah, well, there's many factors, but certainly inflation is, one of the major factors here. Whereas the rate of inflation is not kept up with, people's wages and income, so they're not able to afford the same standard of living. And this is part of the cycle that's artificially created by having a central bank, print money and manage the interest rates and essentially, management of the monetary system rather than having it based in, actual value with a fixed amount of money in the system. So these kind of cycles, right, are going to go through the boom and bust, and the average, debt slave, which is, us regular folks, we're going to experience the brunt and the misery of this. And it's really is a travesty. And I don't know what to say, about if you can't afford a place to live, what are your options? Because they're not good, right? So what do you go live with your parents or a relative or couch surf or live 3 adults to a bedroom, and essentially, right, we're turning back the standard of living. But something has got to give, right? Because we can't have everybody be homeless, especially in Canada.
Yes, it's you're just talking about a huge issue going on here, and my son and his generation are quite livid, and in fact, he's expressed anger about it. So it looks like it's directed at me, like your generation did this, you did this, basically. And so I'm like, I don't know what I did. Like I did buy property for cheap, and then it went up, and then I sold it, and I got money from that. You know what I mean? Like that's actually how I accumulated any wealth at all. Was I was kind of at the right time in history, where the first condo that I bought at the age of 25 was $56,000. It was a 3-bedroom, probably $1,300 square foot home that probably right now is worth $600,000 in Burnaby, where I first bought that. But we're not there anymore. Now, if you just want to get into the market, our wages have not gone up to the same degree that our property has. And they're quite upset because there's just no way to now get in. And, unless you kind of accept that burden that you're talking about, the burden of paying the mortgage and,
right, you're right. Because people who live in expensive real estate markets, like, in the United States, for example, in Northern California, San Francisco and Silicon Valley, obviously San Francisco is going through a major decay and fall right now, but just go back a few years, it's the most expensive real estate market in the country. And people who live there can spend 75-80% of their earnings just on housing, right? On rent or mortgage payments. And that is not sustainable. There's no way you're going to be able to save up any money. You won't be able to support a family when you're paying such high rates. And I think, in Manhattan and several other markets, Montreal, I know, is extremely expensive. I'm sure Vancouver as well. Those kind of places, people have to spend almost, a huge majority of their earnings on housing and live modestly. Right. I know, from being in plenty of people's apartments in New York City that, you get very creative with how to save space.
Right. You all start taking a different part of the room or something. And I've seen some of those crazy things that people are doing. I kind of I've been presenting to my family. I mean, I'd like to live in a huge house like the Dallas. Remember that old series Dallas and the Ewings? Yes. They would all live together in a big home. And I said, well, let's do that. Let's live together, and we take our, our incomes and make it all work. And some kids are for it, some aren't, but it has to be the right situation. And, why would I want to live with my mother again? So there's some of that going on. But, there might be, some certain ethnicities or groups sometimes do this. I mean, sometimes the Chinese will, or even the East Indians or people that have come from other part of the world, they love to be with family. They could only afford to be with family. So they get a decent house, and everyone gets a bedroom, and you cohabitate. And we become not used to doing that. We become, I need my own really nice home for my 2% mortgage and I can afford it and I've got this. But all of a sudden, upset the fruit bowl, we've got problems coming our way. So we might have to reevaluate what we think is normal life.
Yeah, no, you're right. And, what you describe is actually a very interesting sociologic phenomenon. And it's been written about by historians. But when you have immigrant populations that go to other nations, right, that they struggle at first, but they, try to establish businesses. Like, for example, you could look at all of the Korean grocery markets in New York, for example, right? So many Korean immigrants came over to New York City and established these grocery markets and became, successful business owners. But what they did was, right, when they first came over and they had nothing, they wanted to get ahead. So they sacrificed. So they crammed as many people, into a house. They lowered their standard of living. They spent all their time working to establish a business or save up to rent a space and buy inventory. And by doing that, they were successful. But, we didn't expect to have that existence in our life. We expected that our parents and grandparents and their grandparents have already established themselves in this nation, right? And that we would be, able to establish ourselves perhaps even in the professional class. So having to compromise, lower the standard of living, live life as a poor immigrant is certainly not what young people expected to experience when all of the pop media filled them with hopes and dreams and fantasies about, wealthy lives of glory and college degrees and parties and girls and all of that stuff.
Wow. My final question, Andrew, Mr. Kaufman, you have been searching out the truth on many things. I mean, do you think it is an actual agenda to bankrupt and financially strap a lot of the world so that we're in trouble, and then food is in trouble and lodging is in trouble and general mayhem that makes us miserable? Like, if we don't have a good place to live, if we don't have food, if we don't have funds, we don't feel very happy, and do you think it is their agenda? Because the WEF will say you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. Is that a blazing lie? But is that their agenda, to make sure that we don't own anything and they bankrupt a lot of the world?
Yeah, well, look, one of the most successful business models is the subscription business model, right? Where every so often, right, every month, every week, whatever it is, you keep paying for a service. So if we own nothing and rent everything, that means everything is a subscription service. So if you're the managers or the owners of the world, you would recognize that as one of the most lucrative business models. And it allows, for tight control of the resources. And this is how people can be controlled. And this is essentially what, the World Economic Forum and the Great Reset are all about. And it's in their own documentations. But I want to mention something very interesting that sort of hidden knowledge, because they refer to this whole operation as the Great Reset. And so I'm also someone who studies law as well as finance, and I happen to have Black's Law Dictionary in my library. So I looked up, and someone suggested this to me, so it wasn't just my idea, but I looked up the word reset. And it describes a theft, a transfer of ownership against property owners' rights. So in other words, if the plan is that you'll own nothing and rent everything, then that means that everything you own now will have to be transferred to someone else's ownership. And since reset means a great theft, essentially somebody is going to steal everything that we own. And that's what the reset is about. And that's why we're going to have to rent it. And that might be what we agree to cancel all our debt. is that we, agree that we give up ownership of all our property. And some property, we can't really consider that we own now, because if we have a mortgage to pay off for 30 years and a lien by the bank on our house, do we really own it? If we have to pay property taxes, even if we own the house outright and don't have any mortgage to pay on it, but we still have to pay property taxes, do we really own it? If we have a vehicle that we have to pay insurance, personal property tax on, and other, and those kind of expenses to the government, do we really own that automobile? So we've got to really kind of rethink our experience with respect to property rights, with respect to abundance and our financial state, with respect to our debts and those obligations, to see, realize that we're really getting a raw deal, and that deal is going to get much worse. And if we're not aware of what the actual offer is that's going to be presented to us, we're likely to get ourselves in a world of trouble.
Yes. And, it's that world of trouble that we began seeing because of talking to so many experts on the show, because of talking to people like yourself that were watching sort of world trends and understanding what they were doing. We had a great interest rate, and the housing market was still booming in the British Columbia area when we felt that we could see the signs coming. And I quite specifically needed a word from God, and I opened my Bible, and I find out today that you've got Jewish background, but nonetheless, I open Ezekiel. I said, God, I need a word from you. Like, do we sell or do we stay? I need a word from you, God. And I opened my Bible to Ezekiel 12. And in the first six verses, I start reading. It just opens up to that page. I've never seen this before. I didn't know it was there. And it says, Son of man, basically, pack your bags and go. And it says it 6 times, in the 6 verses. And pack your bags and go while they're watching. And we knew, we felt that we had received, like we would either be just foolish to not listen. If we're going to call out to God and say, I need a word, and then, the Bible opens and says, pack your bags and go, you better pack your bags. So we never left Canada, but we did pack our bags, and we got out of that real estate investment. We sold it, and we purchased elsewhere in the world because of what we saw coming to Canada. And we didn't even want to reinvest here because we don't trust what Trudeau is doing, whether he seizes assets or he seizes bank accounts. To people that are fighting for the truth right now. We're really under fire here. And so when I look at all of this, I know there are still people right now making decisions about what they should do. Like, what should we do? Maybe you have a little nest egg. Maybe you don't, but you're trying to figure out like what is, and some people, I feel sorry for those that feel they just have no choice, like that, they don't have financial resources to actually dig themselves, claw themselves, buy themselves out of this mess. That's the real sad state, actually.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And, you using your sort of divine intuition to make good decisions for you and your family is an excellent way to go. And, buying land and property and selling it, it's all risky. Potentially, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, right? And we don't need to have it made so much more risky or lose all the benefit because of this financial system. And, one question we should ask is, well, why should the value of the property change? Now, sometimes there's an area that gets popular and a bunch of people want to move there. And obviously that would make the prices go up if everybody wants to live in one particular area. But we kind of have expected, right, the home prices to just keep going up, but nothing is improved about the home, right? So why would the price go up? Well, it could go up, simply because of inflation, because each dollar is worth less. And so you need more dollars for the same value. In that case, it's not actually going up, right? But really, it's the monetary policy from the banks that make the value go up, because they make the cost of lending so cheap because of the interest rates being low during this period when the government is printing lots of money, right? And they're printing money because there are more of those applications and more notes signed by good people promising to pay, because everybody, oh, it's so easy to get money. I just apply and there it is. And I can buy this house. And since everybody's doing that, that increases the demand. But nobody, people do it just because they can. Because I can get a loan, right? The banks are giving out mortgages real easily. So I'll buy 2 homes if they'll let me. I'm not going to realize that it would be very difficult to pay it back necessarily. Because, I want it, right? And then the value goes up, and then you realize you can't afford it, so you sell it. But the value went up, so you actually make money maybe. And then but as this process continues, at some point, the younger people, they're priced out, because every home has gone up in value because of easy lending and up, and the people starting out who have starting salaries and need starter homes, they can't afford anything now, or they have to spend 90% of their income, right, just to buy a house. So they end up renting, right? And this is kind of the situation that your younger relative, I can't remember if you said it was your son, was facing.
Yeah, my son, yeah. Yeah, and now, the family on his side, with 2 grandkids, they're kind of all living together and in a small home, and and my son actually has a down payment that he's able to put into a home, but it won't buy anything. Like
Right.
Now you got huge interest rates, so even if you have money, you don't want to put it into something like that. And so it's quite a dilemma. And
well, listen, if he is a little bit patient, because when everything crashes, that's when all the bargains will be there. So if he still has that nest egg and, puts it in a protected asset at the right time, he'll be able to actually buy something reasonable with that.
Right.
Because
so you
everything
just said
will have to reset.
When it crashes, do you think that's what we're headed for?
Well, it can't just flounder forever. It has to go down at some point, right? I mean, everything has been done to keep things propped up as much as possible, but it's still nothing, the debt can never be paid off. Like, think about this, Laura Lynn, when the dollars are created, right, they're actually, the federal government, the Treasury, borrows them from the Federal Reserve, right? The Federal Reserve just creates them by having that promise and the application, but they lend it to the Treasury at interest. Now, let's say the interest is 1%, right? And let's say, just for simplicity, the Treasury borrows $100. Okay, so now this is how the money or the currency comes into existence, right? So the Federal Reserve prints up a $100 bill, gives it to the Treasury, and says that $101 are due back next year. Now, how could the Treasury pay $101 because they only have 100? Where's the other dollar coming from? Now, you could say, well, there's already currency that existed, and that's true, but it all came into existence the same way. It was borrowed from the Federal Reserve with interest. So they borrow the principal, but they're supposed to pay back the principal plus interest. But that can never be done because they only have the principal. So now, year to year, right, they pay some of it back. They might pay the interest from last year, this year with money they borrowed this year, right? But each time, there's more and more interest and less principal as a proportion of the whole. Mm-hmm. And at some point, the system has to pop. It can't, right? Because if there's more money owed than the money that's available to pay it back, then the debt can't be paid. So it has to be restructured some way, right? That means bankruptcy and restructuring the debt, right? When you can't, think about it. If you borrow for a house and you can't pay it back, what happens? They take the house back, right? Or you negotiate a deal where you restructure the debt somehow. Maybe you give them $50,000 now, they'll let you keep the house as long as you keep paying. Right. But there's got to be some kind of, transfer of property and restructuring of the debt. And that's what we're headed for. And, what's going to force that is most likely going to be a major crash of the economy. And it could manifest in many ways. It could be through bank failures or some other method, even war. Could affect this or make it come to fruition in a different way.
Well, and all of those things just looming every day for, what's happening in our crazy world, for sure. Well, Andrew Kaufman, thank you very much for your time. This has been just really interesting and a fascinating discussion, and I hope it's been helpful. A lot of people watching right now. So thank you very much. Where can people follow you these days? Are you putting your information out there?
Yes. Well, definitely Rumble. Like you, I'm heavily censored. So,
Yeah.
on all the usual places.
We had a hard time finding you, like on the censored platforms. We were checking it out.
That's right. You can still find me on YouTube and Instagram and Facebook, but they definitely censor me there. But Rumble is a great place, and at my website, andrewkaufmanmd.com, and I have a membership called the True Living Fellowship, where we actually learn about issues like law and finance as well as health, so that we can, come together and support each other, living as truthful lives as possible, and share all this information, so we can help each other be protected and sustain our life goals and our abundance for ourselves and our families.
I love that. Thank you very much. You are really a pleasure to speak with. And thank you for following all of these rabbit trails so that we can get some semblance of truth from what the world is telling us. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Laura Lynn.